All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Richard Dick Thomas Memorial Student Competition for 2021, or as we call it, the DTA. We want to thank all of the students, their advisors, our judges, and all of the volunteers that make this virtual competition possible. We really appreciate the flexibility this year and all of the patience that we received from the students and the judges. All of the students were really responsive and helpful, and thank you for providing your pronunciations on short notice. I might find a way to butcher the names, but I practice, so let's hope that goes well. We hope this year's competition will provide you with valuable experience for your future work. Before we get started, a little competition etiquette reminder. Students, please keep cameras and microphones off until it's your time to present. Judges, coordinators, conference volunteers, please keep your cameras on and microphones off until it is time to ask questions. We want the students to have a bit of an audience while they're presenting to make it feel like they're at the conference with us. And to everyone else, please make sure your phones are silent. And to any extra guests, please keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations. And we will not approve of any heckling going on. Now for a little historical background on the competition. The Richard Dick Thomas Competition and Award was established to honor a Washington State GIS pioneer and mentor named Dick Thomas, who passed away in 2006. The intent of this award is to honor Dick by continuing his work of encouraging students to present their original research in GIS, geography, or related disciplines at the annual YURISA conference, and to help students transition successfully into careers related to GIS. We express a big thank you to Dick Thomas and the legacy he has left for our students and the GIS community. So next we are going to introduce our judges and coordinators. Could everyone I introduce unmute your microphone and say hello so that your video pops up on screen? First we have Anna Yost.
Hi.
Hi, Anna. Anna is the GIS coordinator for the city of SeaTac and a previous DTA winner in 2014 for her presentation on elk habitat modeling in the North Cascades. Our next judge, Katie Heim.
Hello, everyone.
Katie is the Geographic Information Systems Manager at the City of Arlington in Washington and this year's Washington GIS Conference Coordinator. And then our last judge is Steve Feinborn.
Hello, everyone.
Steve is the current YURISA board president for another week at least, and a manager of departmental GIS at the City of Seattle. Lastly, we have our two Dick Thomas Award coordinators, Dan Miller, who is an E911 GIS coordinator for the state of Washington 911 office, and also chair of the Community Engagement Committee for YURISA. And I am Taylor Dixon, and I'm a senior GIS analyst for Seattle Public Utilities, and I'm an at-large board member for YURISA. Okay, so for a quick reminder of the rules, each group will have up to 15 minutes to present, with up to 3 additional minutes for questioning. After questions, we will give the judges 2 minutes to fill their score sheets and take notes, and judges can feel free to take notes on their score sheet during the presentations as well. And during this time, the next group should be preparing to present. Please keep an eye on chat. We will be giving you time cues, but also please keep your own time as we will have a pretty strict cutoff at 15 minutes. Before we start our first presentation, I want to give a tiny bit of warm advice to our students. As you present, remember to breathe and keep in mind that many of the volunteers and judges here today have been in your shoes before. And even though we likely won't give much positive or negative feedback, during the competition. We're all enthusiastically wishing you the best as you present. So with that, we are now ready to start our first presentation. The order was determined by the order the abstracts were submitted. Our first presentation will be given by Micah Gelbert. Micah recently earned his certificate from the University of Washington, Tacoma, and he has a degree in sustainable urban development from the UW-Tacoma. This presentation will be the final project completed during his time at the GIS CERT program. And Micah, feel free to turn your camera on, share your screen, unmute your microphone, and turn on your timer, and we'll turn the floor over to you.
All right, let me see. It says host disabled participant sharing.
Oh, that's not good. Let's fix that.
That was just part of the presentation, just to throw you off kilter.
All right,
1 second. Sorry about that.
no problem.
Your time has not started yet.
Okay, good.
Oh, this is not good because I don't see a setting for this, and it should. Oh, there we go. Okay, try it now.
Okay. Let's see. Still getting the host disabled participant screen. Maybe if any of the other presenters are having that. Oh, there we go. Awesome.
Is it working
Okay,
now?
it's working. Let's see. All right, can everyone see the title screen?
We're good.
All right, can you hear me
Thanks,
all
sorry
right?
about that, and I will start the time now.
All right. One moment. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Micah, and I'm excited to share my research on peri-urban areas. The title of my project is A Peripheral Glance, Peri-Urban Analysis of Western Pierce County, Washington. So here's a quick itinerary. I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of peri-urbanity, and I will then transition to an analysis of Pierce County, which will include 3 sections: design, methods, and results. And I will conclude with a discussion of results and potential future peri-urban research endeavors. So what does peri-urban mean? Well, UNESCO defines peri-urban areas as zones of transition from rural to urban land uses located between the outer limits of urban and regional centers and the rural environment. The boundaries of peri-urban areas are porous and transitory as urban development extends into rural and industrial land. Now, while some researchers use the term to identify specific places, others use the term more ambiguously to describe any space that is on the periphery of urban areas. For the purposes of my project, peri-urban areas are places on the fringes of urban growth boundaries that cannot be strictly defined as either urban or rural. The model on the slide provides a visual of the general spatial orientation of peri-urban areas. In metropolitan regions with multiple urban centers, peri-urban areas overlap and their demarcation becomes more elusive. And this is the case with my study area, which I have broadly defined as Western Pierce County. I used land use designations and zoning data from Pierce County GIS data portal to select the zoning designations and community plans listed in the slide. The land use types were chosen based on ground truthing methods using Google Earth Pro and referencing the metadata for descriptions. So why should we care about peri-urban areas? Well, I'm going to offer 2 reasons, but there are many. First, these areas offer opportunities in environmental and social sustainability. Pierce County's fertile lands and sustainable agricultural practices such as no-till farming, cover cropping, the composting of livestock manure, and organic farming should be preserved and promoted in the county. But these practices and lands are threatened because these areas are often serve as accessory spaces to urban areas where waste management facilities, water treatment facilities, and industrial plants are located. And being that these facilities can have disastrous impacts on peri-urban ecosystems, it is important that adequate attention is given to their functioning and development. Also, as more people move to the region, residential development is increasing in peri-urban areas, which can have negative effects on soil health and quality. According to La Trobe University, peri-urban areas are the fastest growing regions in many countries. And as the world becomes increasingly urban and more people move to urban peripheries, development in these areas should proceed with caution. Peri-urban areas also offer opportunities in social sustainability, in that they foster relationships between agricultural communities and urban residents through farmers markets, agritourism, and volunteer programs. The second reason for why we should care about peri-urbanity is that it connotes a spatial perspective that is regional rather than central. A peri-urban perspective encourages a new way of thinking about space that goes beyond binary urban and rural classifications. And I want to promote the idea that space is not fixed, but rather processual, constantly evolving, and in flux. So this research focuses on the environmental issues related to peri-urbanity. I've already discussed how peri-urban areas tend to occupy fertile lands, and this is especially the case in my study area. The land between the glaciers of Mount Rainier and the saltwater of Commencement Bay, it's incredibly fertile and hosts a complex and sensitive ecosystem. And this begs the question, to what extent has urbanization occurred in environmentally sensitive areas? My hypothesis was that substantial urban development has occurred in these areas, and that this poses threats to peri-urban environments, because the destruction of environments can mean the destruction of agricultural peri-urban practices. So peri-urban analysis involved three major steps. First, to retrieve a land cover change index. Second, to generate an environmental sensitivity index for my study area using raster overlay. And third, to determine the amount of urban change within environmentally sensitive areas. So the first step was to obtain a layer that contained polygons representing urban change. The NLCD data website included a land cover change index, which needed to be manipulated for use. The data included change from 2001 to 2016. And while this data was not as recent as I would have liked, it was suitable for the purposes of the project. The steps required to prepare the data included converting the raster image to polygons, selecting and extracting all urban change features, and clipping the layer to Pierce County. And these processes produced polygons that represented all urban change polygons within my study area were selected, extracted, and designated as peri-urban change for later use. And figure 3 represents urban change, where red polygons are within my study area and yellow are outside of it. The second major step was to generate an environmental sensitivity index. This slide includes the 5 data layers used to produce the index in their initial states. The urban growth area layer, retrieved from the Puget Sound Regional Council, demarcates boundaries where urban development should occur. And this boundary is meant to put a limit on urban growth and is generally used to mitigate the deleterious effects of development on natural and agricultural lands. The peri-urban area layer will be classified based on certain land use designations that are particularly sensitive to urban growth. Hydro water bodies obtained through the Pierce County Geospatial Portal represents all ponds, lakes, and reservoirs in Pierce County, and is included because aquatic systems can become contaminated, subsequently spreading to other natural systems and harming wildlife. The biodiversity network, also obtained from the Pierce County Geospatial Portal, includes areas that are identified and protected as habitat that is critical for wildlife conservation before it suffers irreparable loss or damage due to human encroachment. And finally, Washington soils data, retrieved from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, will be used to indicate the potential of soil erosion, and it has been clipped to Pierce County. So this slide includes the data from the previous slide after they have been prepared to be used in the raster overlay. The urban growth area uses a Boolean or binary classification where area within the boundary, dark green, is classified with a 0, meaning not sensitive. And all area outside the boundary, light green, is given a value of 1, representing some level of sensitivity. The peri-urban area layer is classified where rural farm, agricultural resource land, rural 5, which is 1 unit per 5 acres, and rural sensitive resource land use designations are given a value of 3. Park and recreation, boarding, and rural separator designations are given a value of 2, and all other land use designations are given a value of 1. Peri-urban areas are classified this way because of the discontinuous nature of peri-urbanity and to highlight the zoning types that are of ecological value. The procedures used to produce the rasters in figures 10 and 11 are similar. First, hydro water bodies were clipped to my study area. And then for both layers, prior to converting to rasters, the multi-ring buffer tool was used to create radiuses around the polygons, which indicate 4 areas of sensitivity, where the innermost areas are given a value of 4 and outermost areas given a 1. The buffer distances for the hydro water bodies are 0.25, 0.5, and 0.75 miles, and the biodiversity network layer uses distances of 0.5, 1, and 1.5 miles. The biodiversity layer has greater radius distances because presumably these areas are especially sensitive and nearby development is less desirable. Finally, the Pierce County soils data was symbolized using the erosion potential field, where low, medium, and high were classified as 1, 2, and 3, respectively. For the peri-urban area, hydro water bodies, biodiversity network, and Washington soils layers, no data values were classified with 0, so that data is continuous. And classification values for the 5 rasters range from 0 to 4. The layers in the previous slide were added together in the Raster Calculator to produce the environmental sensitivity index shown on the screen. The layer is the result of a raster overlay where each cell represents a value, which is the sum of overlapping cell values of the input rasters. Values are represented using a green to red gradient called slope and arc map. And sensitivity ratings range from 0, which is low sensitivity, to 13, which is highly sensitive. The environmental sensitivity index has been clipped to Pierce County. The final major analytical step was to determine how much urban change is within each environmental sensitivity class, or ESC. Doing so involved using the intersect tool to combine the urban change layer with the environmental sensitivity index. Once intersected, a layer was output that included all urban change symbolized by its location within the environmental sensitivity index. And the 4 red boxes in figure 15 are covered in the following slide. So I chose 4 areas for ground truthing to examine the types of development that are occurring in the most sensitive areas. The image on the top left is in northern Bonnie Lake to the east of Lake Tapps. The image on the top right is to the south of Lake Tapps near the Prince Basin. The bottom left image is located at the southwestern border of Bonnie Lake to the east of the Carbon River and north of Fennel Creek. And the bottom right image is in southern Ording surrounding the Puyallup River. And the 4 areas are all near water and residential. And this is especially concerning considering that Pierce County's Department of Developmental Engineering states that the typical construction practice of residential development consists of stripping the building site of all vegetation and in many cases the topsoil. And this leaves the site very susceptible to severe erosion from rainfall, winds, and offsite tracking of soil. After intersecting the 2 layers, I was able to produce a graph that includes the acres and % of urban change within each sensitivity rating. To determine acres, I used select by attribute and input a sensitivity rating, 1, 2, 3, etc., which selected all urban change polygons that have that rating. I then viewed the statistics of the selected values to find the sum acres and entered the value into the graph. The graph reveals that 79% of urban change has occurred in an area with an ESC of 2 through 6, and 14% within ratings of 7 through 10. Fortunately, little growth has occurred in areas with a sensitivity rating of 11 through 13, However, the amount of growth in moderate and moderate to high areas is concerning. And what's even more concerning is the fact that almost 100% of urban change has occurred in some degree of environmentally sensitive area. So this research is called a peripheral glance because it only focuses on the environmental side of peri-urbanity. A more comprehensive analysis would also include a social, political, and economic evaluation. Moreover, the designation of peri-urban areas would be created not using pre-existing zoning, but by relying on participatory GIS like interactive mapping or counter mapping, which would make for an analysis that more closely relates to the theoretical foundations of this research. Despite these shortcomings, my research does provide a model for future peri-urban research, and the steps are pretty simple: to determine urban change over a period, to generate an environmental sensitivity index, and then to determine how much urban change has occurred in these sensitive areas. And furthermore, this research advocates for the preservation of agriculture in Pierce County. Of course, as the region continues to grow in population, residential development is crucial. And as such, my research does not oppose residential development, but encourages developers to be aware of the ecological effects it may cause. Thank you for listening, and I can take this time to answer any questions. Let me get this back up so I can see everyone.
Mike, I have a question.
Yeah.
At the beginning, you were showing that you had mixed the cities and the land uses together. So I think Ording and Buckley were in the list, and then there were some land uses. Tell us a little bit about why you needed to do that, or yeah.
So one of the main challenges with this project was actually figuring out what I wanted to define as a peri-urban area. The theoretical foundation of this research is influenced by the writings of Henri Lefebvre, which can be very complex at times. And so, you know, I relied on the land use designations and chose Ording and Bonnie Lake and other cities along with land use types because in preparation for this research, I went and drove around the areas and kind of looked and tried to see, okay, well, you know, this phenomena of having both urban and rural kind of feel, it makes me want to include it. And so that was the main reason. I know that the use of these designations might be a little bit weird, but that was pretty much the main reason for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Micah, my question is, during this project, did you identify areas that you feel kind of either strongly towards doing in the future of GIS? Like, were there certain elements or certain types of operations that you enjoyed doing the most? Maybe analysis or data management or raster versus vector analysis?
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed the raster overlay, kind of compiling the different data and seeing how that worked. As I mentioned at the end, kind of the participatory GIS aspect, I'm really interested in kind of examining further in the future, whether in a graduate program or just in a job, by going and talking to people, see how they define where they live, and perhaps create more of a peri-urban designation that fits what the inhabitants of those areas see as peri-urban. And so yeah, I think there's some technical applications that are desired in this project that I didn't get to do, but yeah, I will always be thinking about peri-urban and thinking peripherally. Yeah.
Great.
So.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's give the judges a couple minutes to finish jotting down notes and maybe applying some scores. And thank you, Micah, for presenting. Just a reminder to the judges, you won't have to submit your final scores today. You can submit them anytime before next Thursday. But so you will have time to go back and adjust scores as you see fit. Next, we're going to have Sam Payne. I'm going to wait to introduce the project. I'm just giving him opportunity to know that he's coming up next. And we also intend to have a 10-minute break after the third presentation. And if any of the judges need that to come sooner, then we can also adjust when that's going to happen.
You're muted, Taylor.
I knew that happened at least once. Next, we have Sam Payne, who is a Washington resident but attends Oregon State University. He's presenting a project on modeling habitat, suitability, and connectivity for fishers in the Puget Lowlands. Sam, the floor is yours, and I'm going to start your timer.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, Taylor. Let's see, so I get this slideshow set up. So could everybody see my slide here? Great. Well, thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here today. It really is a pleasure to have this chance to speak about this project. Just really quickly, a little bit about myself. As Taylor mentioned, I'm a student in an online master's program for Fish and Wildlife Science at Oregon State University. This is for a capstone project that I completed in the fall of 2020. My advisor was Brendan McComb. As someone who's in a non-GIS program, I might be a little bit out of my element here, but I hope you enjoy this presentation. So the topic again is modeling habitat suitability, connectivity for fishers in the Puget Lowlands. So why fishers? Most people that I talk to really haven't even heard of what a fisher is. Might conjure images of a fisherman, a fishing boat. But these fishers are part of the mustelidid family that is related to weasels, badgers, wolverines. To me, they really look like a mix of a marten and a badger, big, stout, robust weasel-shaped critters. Fishers are carnivores, and they eat, they eat what they can get their hands on. Usually there's rabbits, porcupines, and small birds. Interestingly, they're one of the few specialized predators of porcupines. They could travel pretty big distances. From their natal den sites, they've been known to disperse up to 55 kilometers. And I think they're just a really cool animal. And they live in mature and old growth forests, which in our region is a limited resource. Unfortunately, they had been extirpated from Washington and really much of the United States. This was due primarily to trapping, hunting, and habitat loss. And luckily, they've been reintroduced with some success in Washington. And actually, there was some good recent news out of the North Cascades, the first successful breeding pair that they've had there. And I've never seen a fisher before, either in a zoo or in the wild. And to me, that prompts the question, when will they return to our local lowland forests? And how can we prioritize habitat conservation for fishers? There are a lot of other fisher habitat suitability models, which this draws from, but they tend not to focus on developed regions. And to my knowledge, connectivity modeling hasn't been applied to the Puget Lowlands before. And I intend this information to serve as a conservation tool to prioritize important habitat areas and corridors. So this slide shows a little bit about the native range of fishers. In blue, we have the historical range over here, and in yellow, we have the current range. As you can see, the blue is mostly in the United States where they've been extirpated except for a few of the northeastern areas and a couple pockets throughout. In Washington, they live west of the Cascades, or they used to, and in a portion of the Blue Mountains and the Selkirk Mountain ranges. And this slide shows where some of the recovery areas are that were identified by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Reintroductions have occurred in 3 areas. One is the Olympic recovery area. One is in the Mount Rainier National Forest, or Mount Rainier National Park, area of the Cascade recovery area, and quite recently in the North Cascades. So the population and range of these reintroduction areas has been growing, and with some success, this might lead to eventual delisting in Washington, although it is a bit early to know for sure. So this begs the question, as these populations and ranges expand, where are they going to end up in Washington outside of these recovery areas? So the study area for my project is the Puget Lowlands ecoregion. This is adjacent to recovery areas on both sides. It's characterized by development, a lot of habitat loss and fragmentation. And I want to answer the question, is there suitable habitat for fishers in this ecoregion? And is there suitable habitat connectivity between the patches? The first step of this process is to identify habitat selection parameters that fishers use that we can apply to the model. And I use parameters that are very similar to what WDFW did when they defined these recovery areas. And there's basically 3 parameters. They have forests with a mean diameter breast height greater than 20 inches, forests with canopy cover greater than 70%, and forests with conifer cover greater than 30%. And these really are indicators of a mature forest, perhaps something like what you'd see on this left side of that image. There's been a lot of research that's gone into fisher habitat modeling, and these have been shown in empirical studies to be among the best predictor variables. And fortunately, these 3 are available in data sets at wide spatial scales. So the data set that I use for this is going to be from Oregon State University's LEMMA GNN structure data set that uses remote sensing data and has 30-meter pixel size. The next step of the process is to define core habitat areas. And this is done and the size that I use to define core habitats are areas that are greater than 3 square kilometers, which corresponds to the minimum home range size for fishers. These are large enough for single animals, but not for entire populations. And home ranges of fishers, they tend to live in areas with a mosaic of late, mid, and early cereal forests. And often they have greater than 25 of their home range represented as mature forest. So to calculate this, I use a point density calculation derived from the raster layer that's transferred to a point vector layer. And then I use the criteria if the core that meets the core habitat criteria, if 25% of the surrounding pixels with a 100-meter search radius are mature forests. And this comes up with 101 core habitat areas that range in size from 3 to 92 square kilometers. This slide here shows what some of that data processing actually looks like. On the top left here, we have the results of the habitat suitability model with the dark green here showing areas that meet that mature forest criteria for those 3 parameters. The light green areas show areas of younger forest, and then the other colors are other various land use types. The top right shows that point density raster calculation. And then on the bottom left, it shows how that gets translated into areas of core habitats shown in black. And the bottom right one is the resistant surface layer, which I'll talk about in just a second. So far, I've talked about the habitat suitability model, and the next step is connectivity. So for this analysis, I use the linkage mapper software, which is a model that identifies the lowest cost corridors between suitable habitats. And a component of cost-weighted corridor models is a resistance surface layer. And this defines essentially the difficulty of an animal moving across the landscape during dispersal. So on the left, you'll see a table. And at the very top, we have mature conifer and mixed forest with a relative resistance value of 1. And this goes all the way down to 1,000 for high intensity development in open water, which is essentially to say that it's 1,000 times more difficult for a fisher to travel through water or high intensity than its preferred habitats, which is mature forests. These numbers are derived essentially from professional judgment, and lack of empirical testing to create these is really a known limitation of these types of analysis. Oh, and to reiterate, the data set used for this is the USGS GAP landfire data set to get land use types. Also, to further refine the road network, I transformed the vector layer from WASDOT's road layers on their major highways to show them more succinctly as high intensity areas, which really didn't come through in the USGS land use data set. And this is what the output looks like. Oh, and just as a reminder, well, not a reminder, but for the linkage mapper analysis, the linkages have a minimum Euclidean distance threshold of 60 kilometers because that was a little bit above the maximum distance that fishers are expected to disperse. And on the left here is what the output looks like. All the black areas are core habitat areas that were identified. There's 101 of these. The blue represents areas with no identified corridors and poor habitat connectivity. And the red represents high quality corridors, which are identified in the analysis. So this is a bit zoomed out. I'll zoom in and just talk about a couple counties. This is King County where I live. As you can see, there's quite a few core habitats identified sort of in the peripheral of the Cascade foothills here. This county shape might look a little funny to you. That's because it's clipped to the ecoregion for the Puget Lowlands. And these diagonal hatches show area of public lands because that's important for land use management decisions. There was only one core habitat area that was identified sort of in the interior region, and that is here. This is Bridle Trails State Park in Bellevue. As you can see, it's pretty isolated and there's no corridors to any other habitat areas. And many of the core habitats on the eastern side of the county are well connected to recovery areas through these large forests. So I think it's pretty likely that fishers would eventually disperse and occupy these regions, considering the core the habitats exist for them that's suitable, and they're well connected to those areas. This figure shows Thurston County, also Pierce County is here to the right side. This group of core habitat areas is Joint Base Lewis McChord, and this is really the biggest cluster of core habitats in the entire ecoregion. They're all very well connected in quite large areas, so if fishers were to get to these locations, I would expect them to be able to have self-sustaining populations. Although they're not very well connected to other recovery areas. And you might see there's a lot of forest here that connects them. So you might think, well, why is that? And really, young forest, and much of this is forestry land and intensive forestry practices, and the young forest that exists here really isn't suitable for fishers to establish their residencies and home ranges. This is Kitsap County. As you can see, there's quite a density of core areas within here, and they're quite well connected. But similar to Joint Base Lewis McChord, there's not really a good access route for fishers to get to these areas because they're separated by the Hood Canal. And there's very poor connectivity near the south side of the Kitsap Peninsula. So areas like these might benefit from reintroductions, although that's probably not a priority for WDFW at the moment. And we don't have time to talk about all these, so I'll just really quickly flip through each of the counties. Here's San Juan, Whatcom, Skagit, Island, Snohomish, King, Pierce, Thurston, Lewis, Cowlitz, Grays Harbor, Mason, Kitsap, Jefferson, Clallam. And really briefly, just a few conclusions. We're probably not going to be seeing fishers in the developed areas in the interior of the Puget Lowlands. The habitat just doesn't exist and there really isn't much connectivity, but they probably will start occupying core habitats in the periphery of the lowlands, especially in the Cascade foothills and the Olympic Mountain foothills. And some of these are really well connected to each other and to recovery areas, but there's really poor connectivity in the interior regions. And I think that the importance of this is it identifies areas that are important for conservation and monitoring so that we could see as fishers expand their range in the future, what would be important to protect. And some of the limitations of the study is that they're based on an a priori model, and there's assumptions about habitat suitability and connectivity that are not empirically tested. And thank you all for listening. Again, my name is Sam Payne. My email address here is at the bottom if anybody wants to contact me for more information. I'd be happy to share the figures with you, and I've also put together a manuscript that describes the project in detail if you're interested. And with that, I'll take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Sam, this is Katie. I have a question. Can you briefly address why Grays Harbor did not have much suitable habitat?
Yeah, so if I flip to Grays Harbor really quickly, let's see. So Grays Harbor really is one of the ones that it's in part of the ecoregion, but just barely. So if you look at it, it's this portion and this portion. And you can see on the bottom, there's actually a corridor here that connects other core habitats that you can't see because they're in the analysis area, but outside of what I clipped is the ecoregion. So it's really not a good, I think, snapshot of the entire county. We're just looking at these tiny areas.
Sam, I have a question. You showed a really cool map of the ecoregion at the beginning. Nice cartography. Where did you get that map?
Oh yeah, let's see if I can flip back to it really quick. Yeah, I have the source.
That one.
Yeah, it's a pretty map. It doesn't actually correspond to the ecoregion picture shape that I used for the analysis, but I got the source here if you're interested. Dan Co-Carto, and his website was here. I think he produced it for USGS.
Thank you.
Looks like DNR down below.
I had another quick question for you. Do you know of any of the counties or jurisdictions that are trying to create connectivity? I know that along I-90 they're trying to connect the two sides, but what about in the lowlands?
Not specifically for fishers, but I think that there has been just a move generally to have connectivity through a lot of the counties that are interested in it. There's the like the Mountain to Sound Greenway Trust in King County, and there's all sorts of conservation groups that are trying to create connectivity really everywhere. And I think most of it is for forests and habitat more generally, but a lot of that would also serve to help fishers, at least when the forests mature, to provide suitable habitat.
Thanks.
Hi, Sam, this is Anna. I just had a question about your the habitat selection parameters. You mentioned that there was mean DBH canopy cover and conifer cover were the main inputs. Was there a differential weighting on any of those, or are they all weighted the same for the selection?
So those were, the selection was done through an overlay analysis. I used the Raster Calculator tool to pick areas that had to meet all those parameters. So if it didn't have a large enough tree, it was excluded. If it didn't have canopy above 70%, it was excluded. And same with conifer cover above 30.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's thank you so much, Sam. Let's give the judges a couple minutes to work on their scoring sheets. I wanted to also mention something that I failed to mention at the start, that we do have a little bit of overlap between a couple of projects in terms of subject matter, but I assure all of you that our judges are very capable of judging each project individually. So if anyone else out there was feeling worried, they should feel good. So. We're going to have Marco up next. And after Marco, we're going to have a 10-minute break. But let's give the judges a couple more minutes. Okay. Up next, we have Marco Pacini from the GIS certificate program. He's a graduate from the University of Washington, Tacoma. So Marco, if you are ready, we will turn the floor over to you.
Hi, good morning. Okay. Sure. Quick. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, my project is about the suitable site selection for municipal solid waste landfills in Pierce County using GIS. First of all, let's look at this current situation. Most people are unaware that solid waste management is a serious problem that needs a full cooperation from the community and full attention from the government. That is why the governments are investing time, efforts, and resources to implement and several solutions to increasing solid waste problems. These solutions includes waste prevention, recycling, and composting. However, there are solid waste that are disposed in a municipal solid waste landfills, or MSWLF. Before we continue, let's define what is the municipal solid waste, or MSW. According to McBead, Rovers, and Farquhar in 1995, it is defined as those waste generated and discharged from a single family and multifamily dwellings, and include waste generated from within the dwelling from the activities outside the dwelling. Furthermore, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency added that it does not include everything that may be landfilled at the local level, such as the construction and demolition debris, municipal water waste sludge, and other non-hazardous industrial waste. According to the study and data of Washington State of Ecology, in year 2000, 10.5 million tons of waste generated for a population of 5.89 million. And in 2017, 17.2 million tons of waste generated for a population of 7.31 million. This accounts for a 24% increase in a population and a 64% increase in waste generation. This data indicates the upward trend of both population and the waste generated in Washington State. Unfortunately, the rate of increase in waste generation is higher than the population growth rate. Furthermore, the Washington State waste generation per capita study shows that the average solid waste generated per person per day increased from 9.7 pounds per person per day in 2000 to 12.9 pounds per person per day in 2017. And the average material collected for recovery or recycling stands at 3.6 pounds per person per day in 2000, and it rose to 6.2 pounds per person per year in 2017. Also, the average solid waste disposed stands at 6.1 pounds per person per day in 2000 and rose to 6.6 pounds per person per day in 2017. Although Washington State managed to maintain the solid waste disposal in a landfill to 6 pounds per person per day, the population and the waste generation are still on the upward trend. In Pierce County, the solid waste disposal is also in an upward trend. If you can see in the graph, from 2014 to 2017, the waste generated is still on the rise. And in 2017, the solid waste in Pierce County were disposed in 4 landfill sites. These are the Columbia Ridge Landfill in Oregon, Lri Landfill, Roosevelt Regional Landfill, MSW, and Payne Regional Waste to Energy Facility. As you could notice, 98 to 100% of the total solid waste generated in Pierce County were disposed in Lri Landfill. So what is an Lri landfill? Lri landfill is a privately owned mixed municipal solid waste landfill with a 320-acre site situated in Puyallup, Washington. And the 168-acre landfill footprint has been approximately capacity of 29.2 million cubic yards and will provide for at least period of at least 20 years. However, in their 2018 annual report, LRI estimates that the landfill to stay open until 2037, that was 16 years from now. And the end date, but the end date depends on how much the population grows and how well the recycling program works. With this, there is a need to select MSWLF sites to maintain and sustain the urban development in Pierce County. So my project is about this. The primary purpose of this project is to establish an appropriate and most suitable sites for MSWLF using GIS with multiple criteria decision analysis, considering the potential risk in the environment and human health. We look into the criteria set by the government agencies such as the US EPA and the state of Washington. There are 5 major criteria for these projects. First is the exclusionary criteria, geomorphological criteria, hydrological, humanistic, and land use. In this project, we utilize vector data, raster data, and a tabular data. The methodology. To determine the suitability of MSWLF in Pierce County, 3 methods are used to implement this study. First is the exclusionary method, or what we call the Boolean method. It is based on the location restrictions established by the US EPA for an MSWLF and Washington Administrative Code, or WAC 173-351-130. This location restrictions includes airport safety, fault areas, floodplains, groundwater, surface water, power transmission, and land use. The second method is what we call fuzzy logic based on weighted linear combination method. This is more on subjective assessments to rank the factors, thus prioritizing the dominance findings. The weight assessments are based on the priority groups and represented the preference information. And the last method is the Raster calculation or the overlay algorithm. For the exclusionary method, as I said, it is based on the US guidelines, location restriction guidelines by US EPA. The geoprocessing tools used for this method includes the buffer zone or buffer tool. This created around each criterion to reflect the imposed constraints. We also have the erase tool to define the unacceptable sites and eliminate those areas. We have intersect tool to utilize and compute the geometric intersection of all the criteria and leave only the overlap in the in all layers. And lastly is the vector to raster conversion. It is used to standardize the format for raster calculation in the final stage of the study. The data sources includes the Pierce County Open Geospatial Data Portal, Washington Geospatial Open Data Portal, the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data, the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and the Washington State Department of Health. First is the airport security. According to the APA, the landfill should be 5,000 feet away from the airport runway end. So this is the map for the airport safety. Fault areas, it says it should have a 200 feet setback from active faults and active faults. For floodplains, it's a buffer distance of 0 because the EPA states that it should not be within the floodplain. And the groundwaters, buffer distance of 1,000 feet away from those drinking water wells and monitoring wells. And we have a surface water with a buffer distance of 200. This surface water includes the shorelines, any water bodies, rivers, and lakes. And the land use, a buffer distance of 1,000 from state park and national parks, and 3,500 buffer distance from residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Although the 3,500 feet buffer distance is not part of the EPA, we did included it because of the negative perspective of the people for MSWLF. And the last is the power transmission line. This is necessary to prevent damage in our transmission lines. 1,000 feet buffer is used in the power transmission lines. And after those 7 criteria, we do the intersect tools for the old criteria and produce this exclusionary method with an acceptable areas. In the green one is the acceptable areas, and the white ones are the buffer zone or the restricted areas. Next is the fuzzy logic method. As I said, this is more subjective assessments to rank the factors. The weight assignments are based on the priority groups and represented the preference information. There are 4 major criteria for this fuzzy logic method. First is the geomorphologic criteria, which includes the sub-criteria of slope and percolation rate. Second one is the hydrologic criteria, distance from which includes the sub-criteria from distance from rivers and distance from water wells. The third is the humanistic criteria, which includes the sub-criteria of population density and distance from residential, commercial, and industrial areas. And the last one is the land use criteria, which is distance from the roads. All criteria and sub-criteria are classified into 5 continuous intervals according to importance. The data sources includes the Pierce County Open Geospatial Data Portal, Washington Geospatial Data Portal, United States Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources, the USGS, and Census Bureau. Geomorphologic criteria, it is relating to the form and surface features of the Earth. And first is the sub-criteria for slope. The most suitable sites are those with slope less than 15%, which means the lower the slope, the higher the suitability, and the higher the slope, the lower the suitability. Second one is the soil percolation rate. The suitable sites are those with slow percolation rate, which means the slower the rate of percolation, the higher the suitability, and the higher the rate of percolation, the lower the suitability. If you can see, there's a white areas in Pierce County because based on the Washington soil data of United States Department of Agriculture, there's still no soil data for those areas. Hydrologic criteria. We have the distance from rivers. We use multiple bufferings for this criteria. So the most suitable sites are those far away from rivers and streams. And distance from water wells, same with from rivers. The most suitable sites are those far away from water wells. The last is the humanistic criteria. This is concerned with the human aspect of a municipal solid waste landfill. So first is the population density. The most suitable sites are those with less population concentration. This is the population density based on the tax parcels and Census Bureau, the population data of Census Bureau. And the next sub-criteria is the distance from residential, commercial, and industrial areas. The most suitable sites are those far from residential, commercial, and industrial areas. And lastly is the land use criteria, or distance from roads. The suitable sites are those areas near the road for easy access. Also, a multiple buffering was created from the road network in Pierce County. So this table is the weighted assignments and factor ranking based on the priority criteria. This table is variable, so it depends on the assessments of environmentalists, scientists, and academics, and any concerns with the landfill, municipal solid waste landfill. So these data are variables, and it's not a constant one. It could be moved, depends on the priority assessments. So for the final algorithm, this is the raster calculation. We multiply all the sub-criteria with a weighted factor for the slope, percolation rate, distance from the rivers, water wells, population densities, and roads and residential and industrial areas, and multiply it with the exclusionary criteria, which we did for the first method, to create this map. This now is the final suitability map for Pierce County. The dark green shows the very high suitability, and the red one is are the not suitable areas for Pierce County. Based on the map, it shows that only 2% of the Pierce County land area are very high suitable for solid waste landfill, or account to 23,528 acres, and 976,000 are not suitable. In this map, we selected two sites, clustering of two sites to analyze the suitability. First, we selected is located in Carbonado, Washington. It is west of SF 757 Road with the zoning of forest land. Total land area is 462 acres, sloping of 5 to 10%, and percolation rate of moderately slow. The nearest streams or rivers from this area is 1.3 miles away, and the residential area is 4.2 miles away. This is the satellite image of in Carbonado, Washington. This is the short video flight through of terrain in Carbonado using the Google Earth. So we could see the terrain in Carbonado, Washington. Okay. The next one is the next site is located in Caposin, Washington. It is north of Caposin Camp number 7 Market Road. The zoning is also forest land. The total land area 613 acres with sloping of 5 to 10%. and percolation rate of moderate is low. And the nearest streams is 2.0 miles, and the nearest residential area is 1.9 miles. Also, this is the satellite image of the in Kapausin, Washington, and a quick video of the flight tool for the terrain in Kapausin using the Google Earth. Okay. Since both sites are considered as very high suitability for MSWLF, the factor of design efficiency and life expectancy can be considered. According to McRainer and Flanagan in March 2011, the most efficient design for a landfill is a rectangular shape to allow a maximum volume of airspace per acre of a lined footprint. Also, to compute the life expectancy of a landfill, the following variables and assumptions are used. First, the average year-to-year percentage increase of MSW disposed in a landfill for Pierce County is 2.51%. The average volume disposed in a landfill for Pierce County is 565,000 tons of waste, and the waste depth of facilities is 50 feet, and the compacted MSW minimum density should be 1,200 pounds per cubic yard, and the maximum density should be 18,000 pounds per cubic yard. For in Site 1 in Carbonado, for the waste with 12,000 pounds per cubic yard, the capacity would be 22.4 million tons of waste. And for the waste with 1,800 pounds per cubic yard density, the capacity of the landfill will be 33.5 million tons of waste. For the 462 acres of land, the lifespan will be ranged from 28 years to 37 years. In Kapausin, the minimum capacity would be 22.7 million tons, and the maximum is 44.5 million tons. And the land lifespan of 34 years to 44 years. Closing thoughts. Oh, sorry. The study is the suitability site based on GIS, but it should be noted that a further and comprehensive study should be conducted to determine the feasibility, viability, and sustainability of the site for a municipal solid waste landfill. That's it. Thank you.
Do we have questions for Marco? Thanks, Marco.
You're welcome.
Marco, I had a question about, it was interesting that for practical reasons you needed to study the morphology, but also the roads.
Mhm.
So if being close to a road wasn't such an important factor, how many other sites might you have found?
But there could be a lot, but if I will just show this again. Here, this is also, even the access road, there's an access road around the sites. We're taking a look of the very high suitability. There's a lot of high suitability that is near the roads. However, we also considered the total land area that could be used for a solid waste landfill. So some could be near the roads, but not enough for a solid waste landfill area, and could only be like a few years. So these two are near the roads. There's an access road, and with a bigger land area can be covered for a land area. So these two sites are that I chosen to be a potential site for a suitable site for solid waste landfill.
All right, thanks.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Marco, for your presentation.
Thank you, Taylor.
Yep. Okay, so we are going to take a 10-minute break. So we will start about at 11:20. And thank you for your patience. All right, Steve, are you back yet?
Yes, I'm back.
Great. All right, Taylor is ready. The other Taylor, not me, but so the next presentation is going to be given by Taylor Braden from the University of Washington, Tacoma, who will talk about how GIS can be used to identify ideal habitat and inform reintroduction efforts for the reintroduced fisher species in the Olympic Peninsula. So Taylor, if you are ready, we will give the screen over to you.
Awesome, thank you. And I wanted to give a big shout out to Sam. Thank you, fishers are awesome. I did a slightly different habitat area. He did kind of the Puget Lowlands. I did more of the Olympic Peninsula. So any Grays Harbor questions I might be able to answer. So my presentation is essentially coming home, how GIS can help a species rise from the ashes, in this case, the fisher. And I know we had a little bit of an introduction earlier, but I kind of wanted to give a little bit more of an introduction. Fishers typically live in old growth forests, and they're one of the only species actually to effectively predate on porcupines, which is a pretty interesting fact. In the 19th century, habitat loss, fur trapping, and deaths by cars caused the fisher to go extinct in Washington state. But recently, fishers have been reintroduced into protected areas on the Olympic Peninsula and in the Cascades. And as you can see in the lower right-hand image, Olympic National Park was the first proving ground for the fishers. And the gray areas show fishery locations. But, you know, the question arises, what happens when fishers start venturing outside of these protected areas? I mean, it's all well and good when they're inside these areas, but what happens when they start encountering more people, more fragmented landscapes? So my project essentially set out to determine the habitability of locations within Clallam, Grays Harbor, Jefferson, and Mason counties, and to identify areas of potential conflict, such as where preserving fisher habitat and maintaining human activities such as timber harvesting, roads, trails might come into conflict. So I pulled my data from a variety of sources, including county, federal, and other data sources. Specifically, counties, I went to all of the county geodata websites such as Clallam, Jefferson, Mason, Grays Harbor, and I kept looking for data specifically relating to human impacts, which will be addressed in the next slide, but like parcel data, roads. The Nature Mapping Foundation was fundamental to this project because I ended up using species ranges of prey and predators to help determine ideal fisher habitat. So having those species ranges from the Nature Mapping Foundation was huge. And also Google Maps, you know, who could blame Google Maps? I use Google Maps to help locate campgrounds, backcountry campgrounds on the Olympic Peninsula so that those could be accounted in the analysis. So, of course, the data taken into account in this analysis was the species ranges of prey, the species ranges of predators, the elevation, human impacts, and old growth forests where fishers make most of their habitat. So the 4 prey species I chose were the North American porcupine, which is one of the main prey sources, snowshoe hare, mountain beaver, which is kind of like a prehistoric rat, but they like timber harvest sites, which makes kind of an interesting relationship, and the Douglas squirrel. Predator species specifically dealt with the range of the bobcat, the cougar, and the coyote. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how some of these predators factor into the analysis more than others, depending on their feeding habits. Human impacts. What I did in terms of human impacts is I considered timber harvest sites, roads and trails, campsites, and uninhabitable parcels. Now, what uninhabitable parcels means is essentially areas like middle of cities, pavement, houses, areas that fishers would definitely not be able to live. And so how I ended up finding that out was going to each county layer and selecting parcels that would probably be habitable, like really, really large parks, like 100-acre parks and forested areas, and then just reversing the selection to have everything else that was definitely not habitable to be in those layers. Now, some of the challenges in data analysis, I was very optimistic. Unlike Sam, I did not use a model for old growth forest. I ended up trying to look for it online, and unfortunately, the only forest data that is that detailed, because old growth forests are typically on the Olympic Peninsula are 250 years old or older. I could only find that data really for timber harvest sites. So what I ended up using was a proxy species, such as the northern spotted owl, which really only nests in old and mature old growth forests. So as you can see in the image on the right, I have the northern spotted owl range as a stand-in for my old growth forest. The challenge was the buffers around roads. Roads have impacts far away from the roads. Like I did 2 buffers, one at 5 and one at 50 feet, which wouldn't seem like a big deal, but when you're analyzing essentially all the recorded roads in Clallam, Grays Harbor, Jefferson, and Mason counties, it caused ARC Pro to crash a couple times. So I had to slice up the roads into smaller pieces, buffer them, and then reattach them by merging. Another challenge too was the plotting of campground locations, just finding all of those backcountry locations in Google Maps and making sure to plot as many of them as possible. And of course, layering a new tool. The images, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is that the images as they were for the species ranges that I used were great, but they already had values. They had pixel values, so they wouldn't really work as they were. So I had to create a new layer using image classification, telling the computer that this area equals a certain number, which I'll be getting into in the next slide. The ultimate goal was to create a habitability index, which is essentially, I was summing all the factors together. I was giving them numerical values, and the areas with the greatest sum at the end would be areas of high quality habitat, most beneficial factors, and the areas with the least sum would be areas that had a lot of tracking factors like roads, trails, campgrounds, and uninhabitable parcels. And I had 2 types of data. I had binary data and not binary data. Binary data in which it's present or not present, or not binary, in which there was kind of a range of values between 0 and 2. Now for binary, these were specifically the binary ones where old growth forest is either present or not present, and timber harvest sites in which it was present or not present, as you can see on the left and right sides using the same color scheme. These are the kind of images on the left I was pulling from the Nature Mapping Foundation, and it would have a key like core habitat and marginal habitat. That's what kind of gives way to the not binary classifications, because you can see on the right, I had to georeference the image and then use the image classification tool to create 3 categories, which is not present, somewhat present, which is the marginal habitat in which it could be there, and then present, which you can see in green. And I did this for at least 7 different ranges, 3 predator ranges, which is the bobcat, cougar, and coyote ranges, and the prey ranges, such as the porcupine, snowshoe hare, mountain beaver, and Douglas squirrel ranges. As you can see, they vary quite a bit in terms of what is considered a not present habitat or where they are present. So it was very interesting to factor those in. Now, this is a different kind of not binary. So the fact is the roads had 2 buffers within 5 feet was considered not habitable. It was given a value of 0, so that when it was factored into the equation, if there was a road and it was not habitable there, that was considered not habitat. It would nullify everything in the equation at the end. So I had 0, 1, and 2 for that. I had trails, and I had campgrounds. Now the campground value was a little bit arbitrary, but I based it off of kind of animal reactions and also off of the fact that most of the campgrounds I was basing it on were backcountry campgrounds, and humans wouldn't be occupying those campgrounds all the time. So fishers could afford to get a little close, but they probably wouldn't go all the way in because fishers are kind of shy creatures. Now, the last piece of data was the elevation. Now, most of the Olympic Peninsula was habitable for the fisher, at least in some extent, except for the very highest mountain changes. So that didn't factor as much into the analysis as I expected. Now, the final analysis was with the Raster Calculator. Positive factors such as the presence of prey species, old growth forests, were either added or multiplied, and negative factors were subtracted. So you can see I have the equation that I used, and you can see that the labels are a little bit weird, and that's because I had to do this several times because it was kind of a trial and error in terms of getting the Raster Calculator working, because this was my first time working with it. I also applied weights. Specifically, I mentioned earlier that the predator species might factor into a little bit differently. That's because coyotes are more generalist predators and don't specifically go after the fisher. And therefore, I decided to put a weight of 0.25 so that when the equation was running, it wouldn't factor in the coyotes as much, whereas other predators such as the cougars and bobcats are more specific in terms of their predation on the fisher, so I left those. And the same thing is that fishers prefer old growth, so I increased the weight on that so that would factor more into the equation. My final analysis ended up being this map here, which showed the best habitat, actually in red, in the foothills of the Olympic Mountains, including some timber harvest sites, which was unexpected, but after looking back at my analysis, I believe this is partially due to the fact that roads had a greater weight in terms of being not habitable and the fact that prey species are present on timber harvest sites. So I think those are worth investigating. And I realized that potential conflict between fisher habitat and not would occur probably towards Port Angeles, where you can see kind of the purple area and kind of the orange habitable area. So if Port Angeles decides to expand, there may be some conflict there. So in conclusion, this could be used to inform reintroduction sites. There was some habitability on the western side, some red unclaimed habitat that could be used. This helps to promote the awareness and protection of the land. And I'm hoping that this project can encourage further research into the impacts of timber harvest sites, because there are complex reactions with this. And I've read a paper where sometimes fishers like to hang out at the edges of timber harvest sites just because of the prey that might be present in the timber harvest sites themselves. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. Do we have any questions for Taylor?
I have a question. I was interested, the predators of the fishers, the types of animals that prey on something indicate that kind of there's good conditions for that type of animal. But I think you were also trying to factor in, yeah, how did you factor that as a positive or a negative, I guess?
Well, I mean, it's important to have natural predators there, but let me go back to this slide. I, in general, considered predators to be negative, although, to be honest, the factor of those predators being there usually suggests that there is probably old growth forest, which is like a different impact. So I factored old growth forests as a positive impact to account for that. And the predators like the cougar and the bobcat are usually kind of found in those old growth areas. But I considered it as a negative detractor just because if there is a huge population of cougars or bobcats in the area and you're introducing maybe a couple of fishers at a time, if those fishers are killed before they can reproduce, that might not be the best immediate site. However, you know, once fishers start to establish a little bit more, those are probably really habitable sites in terms of the fact that there's enough fishers at that point that it can sustain some losses and will benefit the health of the other predators.
Interesting, thanks.
This is Anna. I just had a question about the elevation preference for fishers. Do they
Yeah.
have preferred elevation?
That's why I didn't think originally I thought it would factor in more into the analysis. I read a paper that was specifically, it wasn't dealing with the Olympic Peninsula, but it was dealing with the Cascades. And it said fishers usually have only been seen up to a certain elevation. One thing that I could do in future analyses is that I didn't consider necessarily the difference in cover in terms of like what would be like the alpine forests or meadows in terms of cover. That would probably more affect the fisher than what I did. I did more of a value of, okay, fishers have not been seen really above this elevation. And then I turned those into the 3 categories. But to answer your question, I think fishers, if they wanted to, they could go above that elevation, but I don't think that there would be a lot of prey or substantial habitat to guarantee that. Most of the Olympic Peninsula you can see is at least somewhat habitable, which means that, there is enough there to help the fisher out, except for maybe Mount Olympus or a couple of the very higher peaks.
Great, thank you.
What process were you running that was giving you the most trouble? You mentioned that Arc Pro was cutting out on you. I was curious, which process was it?
That was the road buffering. So I had, like, for example, I had a 5-foot buffer and a 50-foot buffer on roads. And this would have been great had it been like very small areas to begin with. But I had essentially had like all of the roads within all 4 of these counties, including the national park roads. And when I told it to buffer all of Grays Harbor, for example, it just crashed. So what I had to do is I had to slice up each county into itty bitty layers by just cutting them and then buffering those itty bitty pieces and then just kind of piecing them back together, like pre-buffered, so that when it had to buffer the next layer, it was only buffering like a very small section of roads, and then that could be like re-merged into the roads. So that was giving Arc Pro the most difficulty in terms of analysis.
Gotcha.
Welcome to our world.
Oh, I want to go back real quick. You were mentioning Grays Harbor earlier. Someone was, in terms of habitability, most of Grays Harbor is only really moderately habitable, although the area between Wainuchi Dam and Lake Quinault seems to be very habitable habitat. So I think the Puget Lowlands just didn't quite capture that yet. But there is some habitat.
Thank you, Taylor. All right, we are ready for our next present. Actually, let's give the judges a couple minutes. I almost forgot to do that. And up next, we have Connor. So give me a heads up that you're ready in the chat, if you don't mind. Okay. So next we have Connor Flanagan from the University of Washington, Tacoma, and he will introduce and present his project to you.
All right, let me share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? All right. So hello everyone, my name is Connor Flanagan, and I'm going to be presenting today on racial and socioeconomic disparity in 911 reporting in Pierce County, Washington. So a little bit of introduction or background. I'm sure everyone is aware of recent events surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and certain high-profile police killings and shootings over the past several years, such as the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and sadly, so many others, both recently and going back decades, really. And I think we're in a moment of awareness and action, which really calls for critical reevaluation of some of our key institutions, such as policing. Most of the research in policing focuses on racial bias in officer interactions. That's kind of this part of this diagram I have here. But there are gaps in the literature, in the research regarding sort of the upstream infrastructure of the emergency reporting pipeline. That's dealing with 911 callers and then also call takers and dispatchers, which are often, these two are often the same person or the same role. So why would we focus on those upstream elements? Well, these are sometimes used for what is referred to as private racial profiling. This is when 911 and the police are used to require or request BIPOC individuals to justify their presence in predominantly white spaces. A good example of this would be the Central Park incident pictured here from last year. Many cities and states throughout the country are trying to criminalize these sorts of false reports to 911, sometimes specifically calling out false reports on the basis of racial bias. These are sometimes called Karen laws. Washington, with House Bill 2632, just passed one of these laws last year, which does criminalize, place criminal penalties on false reports to 911. So for my research, though, I'm wondering how are 911 calls distributed throughout the county, and how does that relate to socioeconomic status? How does it relate to race? And how are the types of calls distributed and related to these phenomena? And so my hypothesis then is that there are significant disparities in the distribution of 911 call topics according to these variable geographies of socioeconomic status and racial demographics. So given that, what data do we have? Well, in Pierce County, all of the 911 calls and data are collected and archived by an organization called South Sound 911. What I was initially focused on was the actual call audio files themselves, which are collected by South Sound 911. But due to the Public Records Act, every call that is publicly disclosed must be manually vetted and potentially redacted. And so for my purposes, the amount of data that I wanted to collect, that would have just taken far too much time. And so what we also have are 911 computer-aided dispatch logs, commonly called CAD logs. And so what CAD logs look like is this is a set of about 10 CAD logs from my data set, which is covering the month of December 2020. And you can see each log has an incident number, a date, and a time. But more importantly for me, they each have a type code, which I'll go into a little bit of detail on later. And then they have a location in the form of an address and a zip code, which as GIS folks, what can we do with that? We can geocode it. And so starting with over 54,000 total CAD logs for that month-long period, and then using a custom address locator with an 80% match rate, I ended up with about 40,000 spatialized or geocoded CAD logs. And so that looks something like this on the map. This is Pierce County for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography. And each one of these purple dots is an individual 911 report. Of course, this isn't really super useful to us at this point. It doesn't tell much of a story other than maybe most of the events coming in are within and around the city of Tacoma and the urban core of the county. So we need a little bit more. So going back, I wanted to talk about those type codes a little bit. These are assigned by dispatchers to every call that comes into 911, and they pretty much run the gamut for what you might expect if people are calling 911 for. It could be anything from a traffic accident to more serious things like shots fired or a bomb threat or something. So what I did was I took all of these and reclassified them into three main categories. The first category is regarding violent type events. These are things like assault with a weapon or child or adult abuse. The second category is near violent events. These are cases which could be violent depending on the circumstances. And then the final category is what I call these justification of presence events. This is really getting to that concept of private racial profiling, which I mentioned earlier. These are things like suspicious person, unwanted customer, anything where someone's presence is being called into question in a space. And so this is that map again, and now the events are symbolized according to those three categories. Again, this doesn't give us much insight yet, so can we break this down a little bit more? And so what I did from here was I built up a couple of indexes. The first one was one for socioeconomic status, specifically for a socioeconomic disadvantage. Using the indicators here, I won't go into detail, but these are pulled from the literature and have been shown to be strong indicators of socioeconomic status. And then for the second index, it's really just one indicator, and it's based on the racial demographics. It's the percent of people identified as white alone within the American Community Survey data, which is feeding all of this. And so with those, I ended up with these two maps. On the left, we have socioeconomic disadvantage. And as you can see by the legend, these green areas are areas with very low scores, little to no socioeconomic disadvantage. And then, of course, the red areas and orange are areas of higher scores on the index, higher socioeconomic disadvantage. On the right here, we have our racial demographic map of the county. These pale purple areas are going to have higher representations of communities of color, of non-white populations. And then these darker purple areas are the more homogeneously white areas of the county. And so I really wanted, well, visually you can see there's a lot of overlap between these two phenomena, but I really wanted to hone in on sort of these concentrated areas. And a really good tool for doing that is cluster analysis, which the goal of this is to identify those spatial concentrations of phenomena such as socioeconomic disadvantage and then high representations of people of color. And so the result of that was these two maps here. On the left, we have our clusters of socioeconomic disadvantage, and then on the right, we have our racial demographic clusters. And for my purposes, the two categories that I really care about are these high, or the pale red, and then this low cluster, or the pale blue. So the pale red here is referring to those concentrations of high disadvantage scores. And then the pale blue is the opposite. These are concentrations of low scores, low levels of disadvantage. And then on the right here for the racial demographics, similarly, the pale red is going to be the more diverse, less white, higher representations of people of color. And then the pale blue is going to be the most homogeneously white parts of the county. And so we can start doing some comparison now, connecting the dots a little bit. We can take those geographies of socioeconomic status and of the racial demographics and start connecting them to those CAD events. So what I did was for each CAD event, I assigned it to its corresponding cluster for those two sets. And then we can do some aggregate statistics from there within each of those cluster sets. And so this first graph I'm showing is showing the per capita frequency of each of these different types of 911 reports coming into each cluster category. And I've sort of highlighted the most relevant parts here. This set of bars on the left is referring to the HH or high. These are those concentrated areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. And then on the right here, we have the low clusters. These are the areas of low disadvantage scores. And so comparing the two, we can see that for this red bar, which represents the frequency of violent type events, these are occurring at 3.5 times the frequency in high disadvantage areas when compared to areas of low disadvantage. Very similar scores or ratio for near violent events. These are 3.6 as frequent here. And then for these justification of presence events, these are over 4 times as frequent when compared to areas of low disadvantage. And you may think, well, areas of high disadvantage just get more overall 911 reports coming in. And you would be right, but that differential between these two is only about 2.1 times. So for these specific categories, those are increasing as you move from low disadvantage to high disadvantage disproportionately quickly when related to the overall increase in frequency. Another way to think of that is to look at the proportions of all of the events which are reported in particular clusters. So looking at this, we see almost 10% of all of the calls which are coming into these high disadvantaged areas are for violent type events. Compare that to not even 6% for low disadvantaged areas. Very similar ratio for near violent events. And then of course, over 13% of the events in high disadvantaged areas are for justification of presence calls. Compare that to, again, not even 7% in the low disadvantaged areas. These are pretty high differentials, and the ratios are here in the middle for reference. So we see very similar results also for when looking at the racial demographic clusters. For violent type events, these are occurring at 3.7 times the frequency in the most diverse, least white areas when compared to the more homogeneously white parts of the county. For near violent events, it's about 3 times the frequency. And then for justification of presence type events, these are 3.5 times as frequent. And also very similar results or ratios when comparing the proportionality of these different types of calls. But one thing I wanted to point out also is this 14.62% of all of the events coming into this LH or the low high outliers category are for justification of presence events. And so what that means, if we go back to our cluster map, the low high outliers are these dark blue areas, which are areas which are like proximate to these high clustered areas, which these are the least white areas. And then as you move out from the pale red, you get sort of more homogeneous, higher percentages of white populations. So these blue areas are really like those in-between areas of higher racial proximity is what I sort of think of them as. And so it's interesting to see in those cases, we do see spikes of these justifications of presence calls. To me, that is suggestive of that sort of private racial profiling, which I was talking about before. It's nothing definitive because we don't know what those calls look like, but it is suggestive. And so in conclusion, my hypothesis was confirmed. There are significant disparities along racial and socioeconomic lines in the regional distribution of 911 reported events in the county. This really points at some structural inequities and possibly like some structural racism in the way that 911 reporting system is both used and experienced across populations. And I think this really calls for the need for further research. I think particularly looking at these justification of presence events, especially in that like low high outlier case, I think we could really take a look at those actual phone calls that where these CAD events are coming from. We could maybe do some natural language processing analysis to look for explicit racial bias. There's research which shows these as effective classifiers of that kind of content. But then more broadly, the increased reports of violent, near violent, and calls for justification of presence events have implications for public health. We know that high levels of stress related to fear of violence or having your presence being called into question has implications on mental health, long-term stability and security for families and households. And so this really begs the question of what is the public or official response? Are legislators and decision makers aware of these sorts of disparities? And if so, what are they doing about it? How should we be responding? Some people may advocate for sort of disinvestment from these sorts of systems and reinvestment in other areas, or some people may advocate more for reform. I think these are open questions that we need to work through and keep acknowledging these disparities. And so that's my project. A couple of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge the faculty at UW GIS, Dr. Matthew Kelly, and then also Gregory Lund, who I know is in the room here. And then also the wonderful folks at South Sound 911 for helping me get all the data that I need, figuring out what I could and couldn't get in a timely manner. They were super helpful for this. So thank you to them. Here's my references, which I'm sure you all can read. And then, so thank you everyone. And I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Connor. This is Katie. That's a really interesting presentation. I definitely see the supporting of structural inequities. I'm not totally clear on how that's showing racism without knowledge of races of those making calls. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the racism part a bit more.
Sure, that's a good question. I think there's two elements here. One is what, like you were saying, we can't make like really clear, definitive claims on what's fueling those disparities. Like we don't know if it's explicitly that private racial profiling without looking into those calls. But I do think the data on its own is showing disparities in how this institution and this system is experienced and used between or along racial lines. And so that alone to me represents a sort of structural racism where there's a disproportionate impact on certain communities, regardless of sort of the intent behind those calls, the potential intent behind those calls. But I do think it really does call for further research and looking into those calls in more depth. So thank you.
I have a question, Connor. You mentioned early on that you were kind of attracted to the audio data, but there were too many redactions. But would that have been a different study had you done the audio? I mean, what would you have gotten? What would you have studied with audio that you studied instead with data?
Yeah, thank you. That was my initial intent behind this entire project. I really wanted to get like a large amount of those audio calls and then do automated transcription and then automated analysis of the content of those calls. Specifically, I was talking about they have natural language tools for doing, for identifying explicit racial bias to varying degrees within certain bodies of text. And so I would have done a very similar like spatial analysis, but looking at the prevalence of explicit racial bias in those calls. And like I said, I think that's really promising for future research. And I may actually end up taking a subset of these CAD logs and requesting those calls in the near future and trying to do that. So.
All right, thanks.
Yep, thank you.
Hey, Connor, this is Dan Miller. I don't know if you noticed at the beginning that I'm the GIS manager for the state 911 office. And so I deal with this across the state. More, not a question, but more of a comment. You probably heard about Sheriff Ed Troyer recently calling 911 because, you know, in probably his relatively white neighborhood, somebody else, a black person driving through delivering papers and got, it's still headlines and they're calling for his resignation. But recently we have a 911 advisory board that mandates how 911 is done throughout the state. And one of the things that came up just this last week was to have training for those call takers or telecommunicators, as they like to be called, on better handling these kinds of racial inequality. So it's kind of a racial inequality task force to do a better job on their end. I know Rhonda, I've known her for a long time, and South Sound, that's probably one of the only PSAPs that I've actually gone to and actually sat and listened. If you'd ever get the opportunity to do that, if they'll let you do that, it's kind of interesting to see on the call taker side of things of when the calls come in, how that person has to respond and the kind of information that's passed on. But good job. I'd be curious to get your presentation because I'd like to show it to my boss and some of the other folks. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'd be happy to pass that over. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Connor. We will give our judges 2 minutes to fill out their score sheets and leave notes. And those of you in the final presentation, be ready to share your project and present. Okay, so with our final presentation, we have Mai Aoki, Jason Saura, and Jonathan Simo from the University of Washington. We also want to note that Kaylee Mosier also worked on this project as well and might be in attendance, but we only allowed a maximum of 3 presenters. And they are presenting their project on beaver habitat networks in Kitsap County. So you guys have the floor now. And all 3 of you will have to unmute yourselves too. So.
There we go. Thank you for the introduction. Today we will be presenting our project on identifying parcels that Kitsap County should consider purchasing to protect as beaver habitat. We'll be discussing the project's background, objectives, requirements, the methods we use to prepare the final map, the data collection, and the results, our analysis, some of the challenges we faced during the project, and the next steps that we have ahead of us. This project was done as part of the University of Washington's GIS certificate course. It was sponsored by Kitsap County, and it involved the collaboration with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Great Peninsula Conservancy. So the Washington State Department and other natural resource agencies divided Washington into 62 water resource inventory areas, or WIRAs, to define the state's major watersheds. And in 2018, the legislature passed the Stream Flow Restoration Act to help restore stream flows to the levels necessary to support salmon populations and to provide water for homes. This law directed 15 of these WIRAs through their respective watershed restoration and enhancement committees to develop plans to offset potential impacts permit exempt domestic water use can cause to stream flows. So Kitsap County is one of the 15 WIRAs that was directed to develop a stream flow restoration plan, and it is part of WIRA 15. So Kitsap County is rather unique. It does not receive a lot of snowmelt runoff from the Olympic or the Cascade Mountains. So the flows are dependent on precipitation and groundwater contribution. So the Kitsap County decided to consider a new approach to recharge groundwater, and that was to involve beavers. Beavers are known to provide numerous benefits to stream systems. By damming streams, they can improve water quality by filtering out silt and pollutants. They can cool subsurface water. They can also slow the water flow, which reduces erosion and decreases flood damage downstream. And most importantly, they create ponds which can raise groundwater levels. So in order to encourage the beaver population in Kitsap County, the county is looking to acquire land that is suitable for beaver habitat by voluntary easement. And once acquired, the land will be protected. So Kitsap County sought our assistance to identify which parcels they should consider purchasing. So this involved identifying criteria for potential beaver habitat, identifying the criteria for acquiring easements, and preparing a map reflecting this information. The county had 3 particular requirements. So for the criteria of the beaver habitat, the county was interested in focusing on the most suitable habitat sites based on a beaver intrinsic potential habitat study by Benjamin Dittbrenner in 2018. This beaver habitat study evaluated intrinsic factors to predict potential suitability. Specifically, it modeled stream segments and examined the stream slope, bank full width, and valley width to evaluate whether the stream conditions were suitable for beavers. And at each stream segment, the 3 parameters were given a score based on its site conditions, which were then summed to produce a score which is categorized into low, medium, or high intrinsic potential. For the criteria of easement purchases, first, the county wanted to prioritize purchasing fewer large parcels rather than many small parcels to reduce cost. And second, using the Dip Brenner study as a guide, the county requested that the process of determining parcel suitability involved focusing on those that were at most 30 meters from these streams.
Right, so I'm gonna take control real quick. I'm gonna talk about the methods we used to get to the parcels that we're gonna submit to Kitsap County for beaver habitat analysis. So our first step was data collection, and I'll talk about that a little more specifically. We had multiple areas we got it from. And we prepared our geodatabase and an vector analysis, including buffers that I'll also talk about in a little bit. So we had to convert 3 of those layers into raster. One of them was already, so we ended up with 4 raster layers that we scored and did a raster calculation on. And then we converted it back to polygons to give it a final score, so that we have a parcel with a score and land use data and everything in one spot that Kitsap County can look at. So for our data, we got probably our most important pieces from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The beaver intrinsic potential layer is a stream layer that was based on Dip Brenner's research study. It already has a ranking of 0 to 3. It's just a polyline. And then we got a forage preference raster from them as well that is already ranked 0 to 3. From Kitsap County, we got parcel data, land use data. For parcels, they wanted larger parcel sizes are more favorable. And then land use, we definitely wanted to look at that to see what would make it easier for purchase from Kitsap County with no conflicts. And we needed the outline, aerial imagery, and then we got the WIRA 15 outline from the Department of Ecology. So the first step, we set our environments to Kitsap County. We didn't need to, for this part anyway, we didn't want to look at anything outside of Kitsap County. There are parts of the WIRA 15 that are outside, but future work will go into that. We added acreage information by using a calculator, and then we actually clipped the parcels to the beaver intrinsic potential buffer so that we're just looking at parcels that have potential beaver streams running through them just to reduce our data load. Our beaver intrinsic potential layer, we put a 30-meter buffer to take into account the riparian corridor. And we didn't expect beavers to really travel outside of that area too much. So the kind of blue shaded areas are the BIP buffers. And then the beaver forage preference was already a raster layer with the darker green being the higher favorability. We turned the BIP buffer into a raster layer, so it still follows the streams, but it's rasterized, as you can see. Then we used that 30-meter buffer to not advancing. There we go. To clip our parcel layer. So that's why there's some spots missing there. We used acres to determine our values there. So greater than 10 acres was what we ranked as a 3, and that's the darker purple there. And then 0 is less than 1 acre. and that's in the very light color. And then for land use, we ended up with about 70 some land use categories, and we kind of whittled it down and combined some of them to just these 20. And then we scored each of those with a score 0 to 3, with 3 being more favorable. And we turned that into a raster layer as well, rank 0 to 3, with 3 being the more highly desirable land use for purchase. Once we got those 4 raster layers together, we did a raster calculator. So the BIP, forage preference, parcels, and land use, added those together, and we got a range of 0 to 12, with 12 being the highest suitability. And it still follows that BIP stream buffer. And if we just zoom in on an area and see that so we wanted a parcel to give to them, but as you can see, there's multiple values within a raster, or raster of each parcel. So we had to do a zonal statistics on each of these and turn it into a table. And we ended up with our final suitability here. We did a short Python script to get the codes down to 1 through 4 instead of 1 through 12, just to make it easier to see. So the dark green is our value of 4 for our most highly suitable parcels that we can recommend. And we wanted it to make it able to just click on a parcel and you would get this pop up there to give the parcel data, number of acres, the wider suitability score, and the category, as well as the property description.
And I will be speaking about our results. So what we did to better imagine, to visualize our results, is we converted them to 4 individual maps for each score, just to better visualize everything. So as you can see on the score 1 map, there is not a whole lot of score 1s, which is kind of nice, actually. You have to squint pretty hard to notice a little flecks of red. Moving on to score 2, we see a little larger and a little more widespread examples. And they correspond to areas such as this, where this is a naval base in Bangor, which probably most likely attributes to why it's a little poorer quality. However, when we go to suitability 3, we see much more widespread examples of sort of an upper tier example for parcels that the county could purchase. And when we look at our most desirable score, number 4, we see that there is sort of a clustering that happens within the south of the region and the northern region as well. And going to our results, here's an example of just the entire bird's eye view of the scores. It's most likely because our higher scores regions are outside of more developed areas such as Bremerton or Poulsbo. So we can see that areas where there's less development and also land lot, the sizes are a lot bigger, there's less people, there's a better forage preference, better streams for beavers that have habitat potential, and most likely they would be the most desirable for the county to purchase. Just sort of going over some of the challenges we had. Beginning with the scope, originally our sponsors were considering us to expand to Mason and Pierce. Quickly, we realized we could not extend to those counties with the time frame we had. So part of our assignment of uploading it to ArcGIS Online is hopefully need to be shared with those counties later. But we are also going to be creating task files to help automate workflow and make a more streamlined example of how they could use our model for identifying beaver habitat potential sites. Likewise, we had some trouble identifying data. We had to whittle it down. Originally, we were going to probably use LiDAR, street center lines, other utility sites. And mainly the biggest challenge we had was finding how we were going to score out her parcels by mainly looking whether they were going to be in the entire parcel or whether we should just look at the stream, because mainly the beavers weren't going to go too far outside of that 30-meter buffer, so we opted for that. And lastly, using a majority score as opposed to the max value to show a more consistent score all across the parcel. Lastly, we're having some issues, but we're overcoming them, uploading our final product to ArcGIS Online on the Kitsap County account. And this is more of a thing for the county, but there is issues with them trying to buy land so they can introduce those animals that sometimes do have human conflict where they destroy property and make damages. The last couple of steps that we have left in our project is creating the task files for other counties to use, hopefully, and so we can train our Kitsap County's GIS analyst. And lastly, also just uploading it to ArcGIS Online so the Water Restoration and Enhancement Committee can use it as a decision-making tool for purchasing parcels. And with that, do we have any questions?
Hi, this is Anna. I had a question. When you guys talked about the land use categories, what criteria were used to group those categories into the reduced number of groupings?
We actually relied on Kitsap County GIS. It was a study that they had performed, and I can't quite put my finger on what it was, but they actually had categorized into groups certain land use that we also decided to borrow, since it's part of a Kitsap study, and this is for Kitsap County. So we figure that would be applicable in figuring out how we should whittle down the 70 different categories into something that was a little bit more workable.
Thank you.
This is Dan. Kind of a question, kind of follow along the same question of Anna, but that one of that last slide there, a blocked culvert. I know DOT and DNR have done a lot of work to try to get salmon habitat back to what it used to be, and probably having beavers blocking culverts that maybe would conflict with salmon habitat would be a problem. Was that something that you guys took into your methodology in cutting out, good and bad areas?
That was, I don't think, well, that was, we couldn't incorporate that study into our 5-month project. It was a little bit beyond our capabilities. But that's also why we're allowing this model to be editable so that they can later incorporate additional data that they might think would be important in making their decision on which parcels they should consider purchasing.
Okay, thanks.
I was curious about two things. Their interest in other counties, what was behind that? And also their preference for large parcels. It would seem like they would want large areas, but did they really want to buy large parcels that maybe only had partial beaver habitat?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So they were interested in Pierce and Mason because WIRA 15 includes Pierce County and Mason County areas. And so, for the WIRA 15 Restoration Committee, those areas would also eventually need to be considered in preparing their plan. And as for parcels, it was more whether they wanted to deal with more landowners versus less landowners. The more landowners involved, the more money it could involve, because you'll have to pay each landowner. And so at this point, they were focused on prioritizing greater parcels so that they could work with fewer landowners than work with like 50 different landowners.
Gotcha, interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's give the judges a couple minutes to continue scoring. Thank you, Mai, Jonathan, and Jason. And please, everyone, stick around. We have a couple of announcements and info after we give up some time. Okay, everyone. So that wraps up our presentations for the 2021 Dick Thomas Award and competition. And we, again, want to express our appreciation for all of our students and judges and volunteers. Everyone was very responsive and patient, and we really appreciate that. I want to give a special thanks to the advisors of the students, Matthew Kelly from UW-Tacoma, Gregory Lund from UW-Tacoma, Amanda Larson from the University of Washington, Seattle, Harvey Arnone from the University of Washington, Seattle, and Brenda McComb from Oregon State University. I also want to give a special thanks to Heather Glock, who is in attendance. She is, in addition to being an Esri employee and a Washington URISA board member, she's also the editor of our Summit newsletter, which is a great newsletter that is distributed to GIS professionals all over the state. And as a reminder of one of the awards of placing in this competition, those of you who place will be featured in our Summit newsletter. So I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. And also a big thanks to our judges, Anna Yost, Katie Heim, and Steve Feinborn. They are obviously very busy with planning our conference coming up, but they took time out to help judge the competition, and appreciate them dedicating some of their Sunday morning to our cause. And just a reminder to the students, our conference is happening next week, Tuesday through Thursday. And I haven't personally checked that all of you are registered, but you guys are granted free admission to the conference just by competing in this competition. And so if you haven't done so and would like to attend, please make sure that you shoot Dan and I an email. We can facilitate you getting that admission to the conference. And also from Dan and I just wanted to say that I'm sure we are very pleased to see the future GIS professionals that are coming up out of our current programs, and we're both very thoroughly pleased and impressed by the work that you guys displayed today. I know that the judges have really difficult decisions in scoring. One more note to the judges, please remember to email Dan and I your scorecards before Thursday. The results will be announced during the Thursday session of the Washington GIS conference. And we will also email out the results and facilitate all of the different awards and benefits that you get from participating and placing. So with that said, feel free to contact us with any questions that you guys may have, but thank you again to everyone who made this possible. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Taylor. Great job facilitating, moderating, I guess.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Great job.
Thank you so much.